from a legal and a moral standpoint, the two large questions, I guess, legally would be, this targeted killing takes place across borders where sometimes the U.S. has consent to be doing this, and other times it doesn't have consent of the sovereign state where it's actually making that attack. And so there's a question as to whether that crossing of a border and striking in a neutral state is legal or, for that matter, ethical, right? So both of those questions. And then second, whether it's legal or ethical or not, then there's a question of what are the proper legal rules under which that operation should be carried out. And the possibilities for that will fall into the general categories of this is not an armed conflict that's taking place in the place where you're doing it and in the manner you're doing it. Therefore, you are bound to follow ordinary domestic law rules and human rights standards, which essentially leads you to law enforcement standards one way or another. Requirement to try and detain, an attempt to try and arrest, non-use of lethal force, and the things that one would normally associate with law enforcement. Second, however, it's possible that one would hold, as the U.S. government does and has throughout this, that the people that it's targeting in these places are actually targetable as members of adversary forces as well as terrorist groups who can be targeted wherever they go, subject to these first considerations I raised about the rights of neutral states. And then third, and I think the issue that will be most pressing into the future will be the question of what about targeting that takes place when you're not in a 9/11 driven conflict down the road. And the easiest way to think about that is to skip all of today's facts and circumstances and imagine, supposing we were talking about a resurgence of Sendero Luminoso in Peru 25 years from now, and the president becomes aware that these guys have decided that America's the bad guy, and on whatever basis decides that there is going to be some form of targeted strike against the leadership of that group. What is the law that is going to be applicable there? And what will be the legal basis on which that happens? So down the road, this is going to be an issue even once this stuff is all, the current stuff related to the AUMF or the 9/11 conflict has gone away. Now let me say one last thing by way of framing. I think that just factually, and again, I'm speaking as somebody that spent a long time looking at precision weapons issues dating back to the 1980s and comes out of this from a human rights standpoint. I look at it and I think, whatever the issues are about people that you are innocent collateral damage in the strikes or mistakes that are made or any of those things, by comparison to weapons as I knew them in the late 1980s, let alone what was used in Vietnam, this is a step forward seen over the longer term that is just astounding to me. And one has got to understand, I believe, that unless one believes that the use of force is simply not justified at all, and therefore any civilian death in this is a war crime or a bad thing or morally not justifiable, if you believe that the use of force is justified in the circumstances and that the question is going to wind up being what's the most discriminating use of force you can apply in that situation, drones will very, very often come out ahead of everything else, including very often the insertion of a human team. The problem with that, and then I will stop, is that for many people, what in one sense is, if you agree with what I just said, is a feature, right? Most discriminating, in another sense turns out to be a bug, because the very fact that it's so discriminating and so discreet enables a political leadership that wants to be able to have recourse to it very easily. Right? And the question that then arises is whether this form of the projection of force, discrete, targeted, potentially discrete in the REET kind of way so that it's hard to attribute who did it, Does it make the use of force too easy? And the one thing that I will say for my own part in that is that I think that that's actually a terrible moral argument, because I think that the question of whether political leadership reaches too easily to the use of force is not a question that one should settle by saying that your forces are not taking enough risks that they otherwise don't need to take. The answer to that question has got to be, you've got to find ways to confine what your political leadership does. You can't confine your political leadership by using your own soldiers as hostages.